I'm going to tell you another story. It's an amazing story. It's the story of Jonah. So when we meet Jonah, the protagonist of this story, we don't know anything about him. He's an ordinary man as far as we can tell, and we can infer that because we don't know anything about him when the story begins. If his life had been notable with regard to his destiny, then we'd have biographical material, but we don't. And so we can make the assumption that he's you, this ordinary man. A voice comes to him and says, "You're aware of a city, Nineveh. It's historically a city full of the enemies of your people, and you really have no regard for them. But I'm God, and I'm unhappy with the citizens of Nineveh, and I'm thinking about wiping them out because of their unwillingness to abide by the appropriate moral order. And the more merciful part of me thinks possibly they could use a second chance, and it's your duty now to go and have a chat with them and let them know how I'm feeling, and that maybe they should think twice before all hell breaks loose, and away you go." And Jonah thinks, well, if you're God and you want to deliver the historical enemies of my people a good smiting, I'm perfectly happy with that, and so I'm disinclined on moral grounds to do anything that might be of aid. And also, there's 150,000 people in Nineveh. They don't know anything about me. I'm a foreigner and an enemy, and I don't think I'm going to go there and tell them, king and all, that they've wandered off the straight and narrow path and that God himself is ready to wreak destruction on them and that they should straighten up. And so, if you read that story and you have any sense, you should be sympathetic to Jonah, because his decision is to make tracks in the opposite direction as rapidly as he possibly can. He boards a ship and heads to a city whose name I don't remember, which is as far away from Nineveh that you could get at that time. And so his reaction to the prompting of his conscience is, I think I'll do something easier. And interestingly for him, easier meant uprooting his whole life and vanishing to a new city. And so that's how much apprehension this call of conscience produced in him. And so he jumps on a boat and makes for fairer climes. So what happens? Well, he's on the boat and he falls asleep. And so what does that mean? Well, that's what you do if you don't follow the promptings of your conscience. You drift into a kind of, what would you say, wishfully blissful unconsciousness and pretend that you can escape from your destiny by just not being there. And so Jonah now runs from his conscience, he runs from destiny, he runs from God, and he embraces unconsciousness. And that's not a good strategy, although it's an attractive one. And the story indicates its ineffectiveness. So he's on a ship, and the storm comes, and the wind blows, and the waves rise, and the ship is threatened. And so what does that mean? It means if you run from the promptings of your conscience, then not only do you risk drifting into a counterproductive unconsciousness, but you endanger everyone on board the ship that you're part of. And so what that might that be? Well, that might be your husband or your wife. It might be your family. It might be your community. It might be your nation. It's whatever ship you happen to be protected by and voyaging on. And so the storm threatens and the ship is in danger, And Jonah stays asleep, and the sailors are terrified, and they unload the ship, and the waves rise higher, and they have a sense in their superstitious manner that maybe there's someone on the ship who isn't right with God. And they cast dice, essentially, to find out who it might be, and the pointer points to Jonah. And they go and wake him up, and they say, well, we're in the midst of a storm, and the ship is threatened, and we cast lots to determine who's at fault, and it pointed to you. Are you okay with your God? And Jonah says, well, not exactly. And the sailors, who are a heathenish lot of pagans and polytheists, say, well, who is your God? And they're thinking, well, he's like the god of the local oak tree, or the god of the local, some minor god that you could stumble over in the dark and hardly notice. And Jonah says, well, he's the creator of the oceans and the land and the cosmos itself. And the sailors think, you probably don't want to piss him off then. And so he confesses to his cowardice, which indicates actually that he's fundamentally a decent man, because when there's a crisis and it's possible that he's responsible, he admits to his error, even though you could imagine doing so under those circumstances might be uncomfortable. And he implores the sailors to throw him overboard, and they refuse. And because they also turn out to be decent people, and so they work as hard as they can to bring the ship to port to escape the storm, but they can't. The storm gets worse and worse, and finally Jonah prevails upon them to throw him into the briny deep sea. And so they do. He ends up in the briny deep blue sea, facing death, but then the worst possible imaginable beast rises up from the abyss and grips him in his jaws and takes him down to hell itself. And so Jonah's in the whale for 3 days in the depths of hell. And because he's a good man, fundamentally, he repents. He says, I made a mistake. I understand now the gravity of my error, and I will do as I'm bid despite the threat. Beast from hell, chaos itself, spits him on the shore, and he goes to Nineveh. And he tells his enemies. And so they listen, and they put on sackcloth and ashes, and the king repents, and the Ninevites sort themselves out, and they return to the straight, narrow path, and the city's saved.